The year was 1847, deep in the heart of Georgia's plantation belt, where cotton ruled the soil and human lives were counted as wealth. Slavery had long since corrupted the land, bending morality, family, and even faith to its will. On sprawling estates, enslaved men, women, and children were treated not as people but as chattel, property to be bred, sold, or worked until death. It was here, behind the white, pillared mansions and within the shadowed slave quarters, that one of the darkest secrets of Southern history whispered through the pines. A plantation lady who bred enslaved women with her own sons, turning bloodlines into commodities. Unlike the violent lashings in the fields or the auction blocks in town squares, this horror was hidden in bedrooms and barns, away from the public eye. Slave breeding was no myth, it was a known, if rarely spoken, reality in the antebellum South, with the transatlantic slave trade outlawed decades earlier. Plantation owners had to find ways to grow their stock domestically. Enslaved women became targets of forced pregnancies, their wombs weaponized for profit. But while such practices were often carried out by masters, overseers, or hired men, the case of a lady of standing forcing her own sons into this practice blurred the lines between depravity and desperation. The story begins with whispers. Neighbors who noticed the growing number of enslaved children on the plantation, all bearing familiar features. Visitors who raised eyebrows at the strange closeness between the planter's sons and the enslaved women. Even rival planters who quietly mocked her hypocrisy behind closed doors but said nothing publicly, for fear that the rot in her household would expose the wider sickness that infected them all. Plantation society thrived on appearances, on church-going respectability, on ladies in silk gowns hosting afternoon teas. But beneath the lace and chandeliers, the system of slavery demanded sacrifices of morality that corroded everything it touched. For the enslaved, this was no whispered scandal but a living nightmare. Women were ordered, coerced, and sometimes violently forced into unions with the young men of the household. Consent was not a word that existed in their world. Survival was. Any resistance could mean whippings, being sold away from their children, or worse. The enslaved mothers bore children who were at once their babies and their master's new property, condemned from birth to lives of toil. These children, born of incestuous command and racial exploitation, embodied the deepest contradictions of the slave system, family twisted into ownership, bloodlines polluted by power, humanity denied at every turn. The lady herself, a matriarch of wealth and influence, justified her actions not in the language of cruelty but of economy. To her, this was no crime but a solution. Enslaved children were valuable. They could be put to work in the fields, mortgaged for loans, or sold for cash. In her eyes, ensuring that her plantation continued to grow in laborers was no different than breeding horses or cattle. The fact that she used her own sons for the task made her unique but not, perhaps, as unusual as polite history would prefer to imagine. Many plantation families concealed similar scandals hidden behind thick curtains of silence. What made this case linger in whispers for generations was not only the perverse nature of the practice, but also the hypocrisy it exposed. Southern planters often boasted of their Christian values, of their honor, of their protection of womanhood and family. Yet here was a woman of society, commanding her household into acts that violated every moral and religious law she outwardly claimed to uphold. To the enslaved, her piety was a cruel mask. To her peers, it was an uncomfortable reminder that slavery was built not only on whips and chains, but also on secrets too shameful to face. By 1847, Georgia was a land on edge. Rumors of slave revolt spread from Virginia to South Carolina, and the fear of rebellion lurked in every planter's mind. Stories like this one fed those fears, not because the enslaved women spoke openly, but because everyone knew that injustice carried consequences. Every act of cruelty planted seeds of anger that might one day rise in fire. And so, this tale remained buried in fragments in diary entries hastily burned, in gossip that traveled through kitchens and parlors, and in the memories of the enslaved families who endured it. Today, as we look back, the story of the plantation lady and her sons stands as a symbol of how slavery corrupted every boundary of human decency. It was not just a system of forced labor but of forced life, shaping generations through acts too disturbing for polite society to admit. It reminds us that history's darkest secrets are not always found on battlefields or auction blocks, but within households, where power unchecked could twist love, family, and morality into grotesque reflections of greed. In the year 1847, when Georgia's plantations were at the peak of their power, stories of cruelty and exploitation were already woven into the fabric of Southern life. Yet, hidden among the daily rhythms of cotton fields and the lash of overseers, there emerged a revelation so shocking that even among slaveholding elites, it stirred discomfort. A wealthy plantation lady, respected in public, feared in private, was accused of forcing her own sons to breed enslaved women on her estate. The scandal, whispered from Charleston to Savannah, blended incest, greed, and slavery into one of the most grotesque tales of America's antebellum past. The plantation system thrived on silence. Outwardly, masters and mistresses lived lives of refinement, hosting elaborate dinners, attending church services, and presenting themselves as the guardians of Southern honor. But behind closed doors, the enslaved were reduced to tools of labor and reproduction. The outlawing of the transatlantic slave trade decades earlier meant that new generations of slaves had to be created from those already in bondage. Plantation owners turned their eyes not just to Africa, but to the wombs of enslaved women already in their possession. Every child born was not only a human life, but a new piece of property, adding to the family's wealth and ensuring the future of the estate. What made this particular case so disturbing was not merely the act of breeding itself, already a practice that dehumanized enslaved women, but the way it entangled the planter's own family. By compelling her sons to impregnate enslaved women, the plantation mistress crossed a line even many in her society dared not tread openly. It was one thing for masters to exploit women they owned, another for brothers, cousins, or neighbors to do the same. But to involve her own sons, to make the act of incestuous reproduction part of her household's economic strategy, was almost unspeakable. Yet, the whispers persisted. Servants in the house noticed the patterns. Children were born with lighter skin, with features eerily resembling the young masters. The enslaved women themselves, though voiceless in public, carried the truth in their bodies. Neighbors questioned how the plantation's slave population had grown so suddenly and why so many of the children resembled the family. A cruel, unspoken understanding took root in the community. This lady had turned motherhood into a perverse form of ownership, sacrificing even her family's dignity for profit. The enslaved bore the deepest scars of this revelation. Women who should have had the right to choose love, family, and future were instead commanded into unions that broke every boundary of human decency. Some were paired with the young men of the household under the threat of violence. Others suffered in silence, knowing refusal could mean beatings or the sale of their existing children. Their lives became a grotesque cycle: forced pregnancies, hard labor during and after birth, and children born not into freedom but into slavery. These children, though innocent, embodied the contradictions of slavery. They were both kin and property, half-brothers to the white sons of the family, yet legally nothing more than chattel. Their existence revealed the hypocrisy of Southern society, where purity and honor were preached from pulpits but violated daily on plantations. The plantation lady, who likely sat in church pews each Sunday, maintained a public image of refinement while privately orchestrating acts condemned by her own religion. Her revelation was not just shocking for its cruelty, but for its exposure of the deep rot at the heart of the system. The surrounding community, though unsettled, largely remained silent. Other planters and families preferred not to look too closely for fear of exposing their own sins. Many masters engaged in similar practices, though perhaps not with such brazen incest. To condemn her would be to admit that the entire structure of slavery was built on exploitation, on the destruction of families, and on the violation of women's bodies. And so, the whispers remained just that: quiet stories shared in kitchens, rumors muttered in churchyards, fragments noted in journals. What is most telling about this revelation is how quickly it was hidden from official record. Plantation families had power, and scandal threatened not only their reputations but their financial standing. Diaries were burned, letters destroyed, witnesses silenced. Yet the truth lingered in memory, passed down in oral histories among the enslaved, remembered in hushed tones by later generations. To them, this was not merely a scandal but a wound, proof that slavery knew no limits in its cruelty. The shocking revelation of 1847 was more than gossip. It symbolized the lengths to which the institution of slavery could drive those who held power. It revealed how far greed could corrupt, how even the sanctity of motherhood and the innocence of children could be twisted into tools of wealth. It showed that the plantation house, so often romanticized in paintings and novels, was as much a site of hidden horror as the slave quarters themselves. For historians today, the story of the plantation lady and her sons remains a reminder that slavery was not only about chains and whips, but about the unseen abuses that destroyed lives behind closed doors. It was about power so absolute that even family ties could be sacrificed. It was about secrets so dark that even those who benefited from slavery whispered them only in fear. In this revelation, we see the core truth of the antebellum South. Slavery was not an aberration on its society. It was its foundation. And that foundation demanded the sacrifice of morality, of decency, and of humanity itself. On the surface, the grand plantations of Georgia in 1847 appeared as symbols of wealth and refinement. White, columned mansions stood proudly over acres of cotton, rice, and tobacco fields, while planters and their families lived in luxury, wearing imported silks and dining on fine china. Visitors from the North or from Europe were often struck by the sheer scale of the estates and the apparent civility of Southern life. But beneath the polished veneer, hidden in the cabins of the enslaved and the barns of the plantation, there existed a reality far darker and more insidious. The system of slavery thrived not only on visible labor but on hidden exploitation. Exploitation that reached into the most intimate aspects of human life. By the mid-19th century, the international slave trade had long since been banned. No more ships brought men and women from Africa to America. For Southern planters, this created a problem. The demand for labor had not decreased; if anything, it had grown as cotton production expanded. Without new imports, the only way to maintain and increase the enslaved population was through forced reproduction. Slave breeding was not a rumor or an exception. It was an economic strategy. Women were pushed to bear child after child, not for the sake of family, but for the sake of their owner's profit. Every birth was a business transaction, every infant another hand for the fields, or another body for the auction block. For the enslaved women on the Georgia plantation at the center of this story, exploitation was constant and inescapable. Their bodies were never their own. When they were not laboring in the fields under the blazing sun, they were being paired with men. Sometimes chosen, sometimes forced, at the command of their owner. This practice stripped away the very essence of human choice. Love, marriage, and motherhood, which should have been sacred, became instruments of commerce. Even more grotesque, the plantation lady herself orchestrated these pairings, using her own sons to impregnate the enslaved women. It was exploitation concealed under the guise of necessity, justified as business, but in reality, it was the calculated destruction of human dignity. The exploitation was hidden because plantation society depended on silence. Neighbors knew, overseers participated, and enslaved people whispered, but the larger world was kept in the dark. Respectable society pretended such acts did not exist or dismissed them as rare deviations. Newspapers never reported on breeding practices. Sermons from pulpits denounced sin but avoided condemning the very system that enabled it. Exploitation became invisible not because it was rare, but because it was deliberately concealed. For the enslaved, this hidden exploitation carried devastating consequences. Women were often pregnant year after year, their health broken by the strain, their lives shortened by constant childbirth. Children were taken from them, sold away at the whim of the mistress or the need for quick money. Men were emasculated, treated not as fathers or husbands but as tools, forced to sire children without regard for their feelings or attachments. The enslaved family, which should have been a source of strength and comfort, was systematically fractured. Hidden exploitation was not only physical but emotional and spiritual. It stripped away identity, hope, and humanity. Yet even in the midst of such cruelty, enslaved people found ways to resist quietly. Mothers loved their children fiercely, even knowing they might be taken away. Couples formed bonds in secret, refusing to let their identities be erased. Songs, prayers, and whispered stories in the quarters carried strength from one generation to the next. This hidden resistance was as real as the hidden exploitation, a reminder that even in the darkest times, enslaved people fought to preserve their humanity. The plantation lady's use of her sons in breeding was an extreme example, but it revealed the underlying truth: slavery was not merely about labor, it was about control. It extended into the body, the family, and the future. By turning reproduction into an economic tool, the system ensured that exploitation was not temporary, it was generational. Children born from forced unions were slaves from the moment of birth, their lives already claimed before they could speak or walk. This cycle made slavery self-sustaining, locking families into chains that no auction block could fully capture. What makes this chapter of history so haunting is how deliberately it was hidden. Planters kept careful financial records of how many slaves they owned, how many were born, and how many were sold, but they rarely recorded the human cost. Diaries and letters that mentioned breeding often used coded language or avoided detail. The secrecy was not only to protect reputations but also to preserve the illusion of Southern gentility. A society that prided itself on honor and purity could not admit that its wealth depended on practices that violated every moral code it claimed to uphold. In many ways, the hidden exploitation of 1847 Georgia foreshadowed the cracks that would one day split the South apart. For beneath the silence, anger brewed. Enslaved people remembered the violations they suffered and passed down the stories. Even those who could not rebel openly carried the weight of their exploitation in ways that shaped their descendants. The memory of forced breeding, of children torn away, of families shattered, lingered long after the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished. To uncover these hidden truths today is to confront not only the past but also the myths that grew around it. Too often, plantation life has been romanticized in stories, paintings, and films, as if the grand houses and sprawling fields existed without blood, sweat, and tears. The reality is far different. Every elegant parlor was built on hidden suffering, every cotton field fertilized by exploitation that dared not speak its name. The plantation lady's scandal was shocking, but it was only one thread in a much larger web of silence and abuse that stretched across the South. The hidden exploitation of slavery reminds us that history's darkest truths are often those people tried hardest to bury. Yet, without facing them, we cannot understand the depth of slavery's evil or the resilience of those who endured it. The silence that once protected the powerful has been broken, and the voices of the enslaved, though muted in their own time, now speak louder than ever through the truths we uncover. The scandal of Georgia's 1847 plantation was not just rooted in slavery's everyday cruelty. Enslaved people had long been subjected to forced breeding, sexual exploitation, and family separations. But in this case, the boundaries of depravity stretched further than most dared to imagine. At the heart of the whispers that spread across the countryside lay one fact too grotesque for polite conversation. The plantation mistress herself had commanded her own sons to impregnate enslaved women. What unfolded was not only exploitation but incestuous control, a fusion of family violation and human ownership that exposed the depths to which slavery could corrode morality. For centuries, Southern society had cloaked itself in ideals of family honor and Christian virtue. Fathers were held up as protectors, mothers as moral guides, and children as heirs of a noble way of life. Yet slavery thrived by shattering families, both black and white. In this case, the very idea of family was twisted into a tool of dominance. The plantation lady, a woman of status and influence, perverted her role as mother. Instead of protecting her sons, she used them as instruments of her will, commanding them to reproduce with the enslaved women she owned. What should have been sacred bonds between parent and child became channels of exploitation, driven by greed and power. For the sons, this control was both binding and humiliating. Raised in a world where their mother's word was law within the household, they could not openly resist her commands. To disobey was to risk disgrace, disinheritance, or punishment. To comply was to commit acts that blurred every line of morality, coupling with women not of their choosing, under circumstances neither consensual nor honorable. Even if they carried out these acts with reluctance, the result was the same: enslaved women violated, children born into bondage, and the family line tainted with secrecy. For the enslaved women, the nightmare was doubled. They were already denied choice, their bodies commodified as property. But now they were forced into unions with their master's sons, a grotesque mingling of power and incest. It was not simply rape by a stranger or overseer. It was the orchestrated will of a mistress, binding her own blood to their suffering. The violation carried layers of humiliation, forced intimacy with men raised in the same house they served, men they had perhaps watched grow from boys into adulthood. Any faint boundaries that separated the enslaved quarters from the master's family dissolved under the weight of the mistress's command. This incestuous control reveals the warped logic of slavery. To the plantation lady, this practice was not framed as sin but as strategy. She may have reasoned that her sons, being white, would produce lighter-skinned children with enslaved women, offspring who could fetch higher prices on the slave market. Mixed-race children were often sold at premium value, considered more desirable in certain regions. By using her sons instead of outsiders, she also ensured that the profits and the shame remained contained within the household. In her mind, this was business cloaked in secrecy, a solution to the economic challenges of sustaining a plantation in a world without fresh imports of slaves. Yet, for the wider community, the whispers of incest stirred unease. Many planters tolerated or even practiced sexual exploitation of enslaved women, but the involvement of one's own children violated an unspoken code. Plantation society thrived on hypocrisy. Men could have mistresses among their slaves so long as their wives pretended not to know. Women could turn a blind eye so long as family honor remained intact. But when a lady openly directed her sons into such acts, she stripped away the thin veil that protected the South's image of respectability. Neighbors may have kept silent, but their discomfort revealed a truth they could not fully deny. Slavery did not only corrupt the enslaved, it corrupted the enslavers too. The children born of these forced unions bore the deepest contradictions. They were at once kin and property, half-siblings to the plantation's white hairs, yet legally bound to chains. In their faces, the resemblance could not be hidden: the same jawlines, the same eyes, the same bloodline. For the enslaved mothers, every glance at these children carried a cruel reminder of violation. For the sons, every encounter was a silent acknowledgement of acts they could not undo. For the mistress, these children were not grandchildren to be loved but assets to be exploited, proof that her commands had been carried out. Religion, which might have offered a moral compass, was twisted into complicity. The plantation lady, like many of her peers, likely sat in pews each Sunday, hearing sermons about family virtue, sin, and salvation. Yet she returned home to orchestrate acts that violated every commandment she professed to uphold. Ministers who preached against fornication or incest rarely condemned the practices of their wealthiest patrons. The silence of the church became another tool of control, allowing the cycle of exploitation to continue unchecked. Incestuous control was more than a personal scandal. It was a metaphor for the entire system of slavery. Just as the plantation mistress blurred the lines of family and morality to preserve her wealth, so too did the South blur the lines of justice, humanity, and freedom to preserve its way of life. Slavery demanded not only the labor of bodies but the surrender of conscience. It forced people into roles that defied nature itself: mothers as exploiters, sons as instruments, children as property. The legacy of this control lingered long after 1847. The children born from these unions carried the scars of identity, denied acknowledgement by their fathers, treated as property by their grandmother, living proof of acts no one wanted to discuss. Their descendants, if they survived the horrors of slavery, bore within them the unspoken history of incest and exploitation. The story of the plantation lady did not die with her, but lived on in the bloodlines she twisted and the memories of those who endured her commands. Incestuous control is perhaps the most shocking keynote of this story because it reveals how far the institution of slavery could bend the human soul. It shows that slavery was not content to dominate fields and labor. It demanded domination of family, of intimacy, of the very bonds that hold society together. By forcing her sons into such acts, the plantation mistress destroyed not only the lives of the enslaved but also the sanctity of her own household. In doing so, she embodied the ultimate corruption of a system that turned every relationship between master and slave, mother and son, father and child into a transaction of power. If slavery was a system built on cruelty, then enslaved women bore the heaviest weight of its chains. They worked in the fields from dawn until dusk, their backs bent beneath the Georgia sun, their hands torn raw from endless labor. Yet, beyond the whip and the endless toil, there was another layer of torment, one hidden behind the polished walls of the plantation mansion and the silence of society. For the enslaved women on the plantation of 1847, suffering was not only physical, it was emotional, spiritual, and deeply personal. They were women whose bodies were treated as tools, whose wombs were claimed as property, and whose pain was silenced by power. The practice of forced breeding was already a wound that scarred generations. With the international slave trade banned, the bodies of enslaved women became the means to grow the population. Each child they bore was counted not as a blessing of family, but as an addition to the ledger of wealth. The mistress of this Georgia plantation, in a grotesque abuse of authority, deepened that wound by commanding her own sons to impregnate enslaved women. For the women trapped in this nightmare, suffering became their daily companion. They were forced into intimacy with men they had not chosen, men they could not refuse. Their humanity was stripped away. They were reduced to vessels of profit. The suffering of these women began with the loss of choice. In a world already bound by chains, their most personal rights, love, marriage, motherhood, were denied. They could not say no, nor could they seek comfort in the bonds of family, for even those bonds were at the mercy of their owners. A mother might give birth only to have her child taken from her arms and sold. A woman might be paired with a man she did not love, forced into pregnancies year after year. Each act of violation reminded them that their lives were not their own, that even their most private moments were controlled by the will of others. The plantation lady's decision to involve her sons in this exploitation made the suffering more grotesque. For the women, there was no escape from the humiliation of being forced into relations with men they might have nursed as children, served at table, or watched grow into adulthood. What might have been brotherly or familial figures became instruments of their oppression. The intimacy was not only forced but poisoned by shame and by the knowledge that it was commanded by the mistress herself. Their cries, their resistance, their tears, none mattered in a world where their voices carried no weight. Physical suffering was constant. Pregnancies came one after another, with no rest for recovery. Women were expected to return to the fields even while carrying children, their swollen bodies laboring under the same harsh conditions. Birth was dangerous, often taking place in crude cabins without medical care. The loss of infants was frequent, but the grief of mothers was ignored. Their pain was invisible to the white family who saw only numbers. Another child born, another hand for labor, another piece of property. Even when babies survived, joy was poisoned by fear, for mothers knew that at any moment their children could be sold, torn from their arms, and sent away forever. The suffering did not end with the body, it reached into the spirit. Enslaved women endured constant humiliation, forced to live under the gaze of those who saw them not as women but as breeding stock. Their dignity was attacked daily, their sense of self reduced by the constant reminder that they were property. Yet, in quiet ways, they fought to preserve their humanity. They braided stories into their children's hair, sang lullabies that carried whispers of Africa, and prayed to a God who saw their pain even when the world refused to. Their resilience was an act of defiance, a refusal to be completely broken by the cruelty they endured. Society ignored their suffering. Neighbors who suspected the plantation ladies' practices turned their eyes away. Ministers who preached about morality rarely condemned the treatment of enslaved women, for to do so would expose the sins of their congregations. White women, themselves bound by gender roles, often directed their frustration not at their husbands or society, but at the enslaved women, blaming them for relationships that were forced upon them. In this way, the suffering of enslaved women was not only inflicted by individuals but upheld by an entire culture of silence and complicity. Despite the suffering, enslaved women carried within them an unyielding strength. They created communities among themselves, sharing wisdom, comfort, and protection. Older women acted as midwives, guiding births and offering what healing they could. Mothers taught their children songs and prayers to carry them through hardship. Friendships became lifelines, small spaces of humanity carved out in a world that denied it. These acts of survival were not small, they were profound, for they kept alive the truth that enslaved women were not merely victims but bearers of strength in the face of unimaginable suffering. The children born of these forced unions stood as living reminders of their mother's torment. Their faces often bore the features of the white family, evidence that could not be erased. For the women, each child was a mixture of love and sorrow, loved fiercely as a son or daughter, yet shadowed by the circumstances of their birth. Some of these children were kept on the plantation, raised as laborers alongside their mothers. Others were sold, their cries echoing in their mothers' ears long after they were taken. In either case, the suffering of women did not end at childbirth. It carried on through the lives of their children. The story of enslaved women's suffering on this plantation is not just one of pain, but of the ways power sought to destroy even the most sacred aspects of human life. It shows how slavery targeted women most cruelly, using their bodies as instruments of wealth and their children as currency. It reveals the depth of corruption in a system that turned motherhood into a transaction and stripped away the dignity of love and choice. To speak of their suffering now is to break the silence that surrounded them then. It is to honor their endurance, to acknowledge the depth of their pain, and to recognize that the wealth of the South was built not only on the labor of enslaved men, but on the forced suffering of enslaved women. Their cries may have been ignored in 1847, but their story still demands to be heard today. Slavery was not only a system of ownership, it was a system of inheritance. The wealth of one generation of planters was built upon the suffering of enslaved people, and that suffering was deliberately passed down to the next. Nowhere was this more visible than in the cruel practice of breeding enslaved women, where every child born became both a symbol of their mother's pain and a tool of their master's prosperity. By 1847 in Georgia, when the plantation lady ordered her own sons to father children with enslaved women, generational abuse reached a grotesque height. It was not only the women who were violated, but the very idea of family, continuity, and legacy. Each birth was a reminder that slavery's cruelty was designed to last forever. The cycle began in the womb. Enslaved children were not welcomed as free souls but as stock. Planters calculated the value of a child long before it could walk, seeing in its tiny frame the promise of years of labor. The plantation lady treated these children as the future of her estate, commodities bred and raised under her roof. For the enslaved women, this meant their children were never truly their own. Every pregnancy carried the knowledge that the child inside them belonged to someone else. The generational abuse was not just about bodies. It was about stripping away the sacred bond between mother and child. When children were born of forced unions between enslaved women and the mistress's own sons, the cycle of abuse took on an even darker tone. These children carried the blood of the white family but none of its privileges. They were enslaved, considered property, despite the fact that their fathers were free and white. The paradox was both cruel and intentional. White fathers denied their children, while enslaved mothers bore the burden of raising them within bondage. The system twisted family ties, teaching children early that their identity was shaped not by love but by ownership. The generational abuse extended through labor. Children were put to work almost as soon as they could walk, fetching water, tending animals, and later joining their mothers in the fields. Play and childhood were luxuries rarely afforded to them. Their small bodies were bent toward toil, their futures predetermined. From birth, they were groomed for servitude, inheriting the same chains that bound their parents. The plantation's wealth grew on their backs, and with each generation, the cycle deepened. This inheritance of suffering was enforced through violence. Any attempt by enslaved mothers to protect their children was met with brutal punishment. If a woman tried to resist breeding, she was beaten. If she tried to shield her child from work or sale, she was silenced with the whip. The system made resistance costly, ensuring that each generation of enslaved children grew up watching their parents' pain. In this way, trauma itself became generational. Children not only inherited the status of slavery, but also the scars of witnessing their parents' suffering. What made the case of the Georgia plantation lady even more disturbing was the incestuous nature of the breeding she orchestrated. Generational abuse here was not accidental. It was planned and executed within her own family. By commanding her sons to father children with enslaved women, she ensured that her bloodline would stretch into the enslaved quarters, but only as property. These children, bound by both kinship and bondage, were living contradictions, descendants of both master and slave, trapped in a world where their existence was a reminder of abuse yet also a source of profit. Their very bodies carried the evidence of generational corruption. The church and local society often turned a blind eye, but whispers of such practices traveled quietly. In many southern towns, it was an open secret that planters fathered children with enslaved women. But when the plantation lady involved her sons, it was a corruption that shocked even those used to the brutal norms of slavery. Still, no one stopped her. Her wealth and influence silenced dissent, and her victims had no voice. Thus, Generational abuse was not only maintained by her family but by an entire community that allowed silence to shield cruelty. The generational consequences stretched far beyond the plantation. Children born of these forced unions carried features that marked them, skin shades that revealed their lineage. Some were sold off to other plantations, spreading the abuse across counties and states. Others remained, growing up beside their father's legitimate heirs yet never acknowledged as kin. This dual existence created identities fractured by shame, secrecy, and silence. For them, generational abuse was not only about slavery, but about being forced to live as ghosts of two worlds, belonging fully to neither. Yet even within this cycle of pain, enslaved families clung to hope. Mothers whispered stories to their children, teaching them songs of resilience and survival. They passed down not just the scars of bondage, but also the fire of endurance. Generational abuse, though powerful, could not entirely erase the human spirit. Within the cabins, where masters never listened, families nurtured love, shared wisdom, and prayed for freedom. Their quiet acts of care were seeds of defiance planted against the system that sought to break them. By the mid-19th century, the cracks in the system began to show. Stories of generational abuse, like those from Georgia, slowly emerged, carried in testimonies, letters, and later in abolitionist accounts. These voices exposed the depth of corruption within slavery, forcing the public to see that it was not just an economic system, but a moral collapse. Generational abuse revealed the truth that slavery was not a temporary condition, but a cycle designed to last forever, passed like inheritance from master to master, and suffered like a curse from parent to child. The story of the plantation lady who bred slaves with her own sons stands as one of the most chilling symbols of this cycle. It shows how power can twist not only individual lives but entire generations. The women she violated, the children she claimed as property, and the bloodlines she corrupted, all were trapped in a cycle that reflected the darkest heart of slavery. To understand generational abuse is to understand why slavery's scars run so deep even today. It was not just a crime against individuals but against families, communities, and generations unborn. The system was built to replicate itself endlessly, ensuring that each new life began in bondage. The Georgia plantation of 1847 is only one story, but it reveals a truth that haunted millions. Slavery was not just lived in a single moment. It was inherited, endured, and passed down like a shadow across centuries. In the antebellum South, silence was a shield, but whispers were a weapon. Every town, every plantation, every parlor had secrets hidden behind polished manners and Sunday sermons. Yet secrets do not stay buried forever. In Georgia 1847, when the plantation lady was said to have ordered her sons to breed enslaved women, the practice became the subject of murmured conversations in Charleston squares, hushed discussions in church aisles, and gossip exchanged across fences. People knew, or at least suspected, that something dark lingered on her land. But instead of exposing the truth, most chose the safety of silence, leaving the enslaved to endure their torment without a voice. Community whispers worked like smoke drifting from a hidden fire. A slave who gave birth to a child that looked strikingly like the master's son, or a young woman suddenly forced to live closer to the big house, sparked speculation. Plantation wives exchanged glances. Field hands shared quiet observations when overseers were out of earshot. In taverns and market stalls, men muttered about strange practices on certain estates. Everyone knew breeding was common in the South after the closing of the international slave trade, but this case crossed an invisible line. It was incest, exploitation, and corruption rolled into one. Yet, though tongues wagged, no one dared speak openly. Why did the whispers never become shouts? The answer lay in the South's unwritten code of protection. Plantation owners, no matter their sins, were bound together by wealth, race, and status. To accuse one family was to threaten them all, for exposing one crime risked unraveling the whole system. Neighbors who knew, or strongly suspected, the plantation lady's acts held their tongues, fearing that scandal would bring shame not just to her household, but to the broader planter class. Even ministers who privately disapproved seldom preached against it, for many depended on wealthy families to fill their pews and their coffers. The whispers, then, were not about justice but about preservation of power. For enslaved people, whispers carried a different weight. They could not speak openly without risk of the lash or worse, but in the secrecy of their quarters, they told and retold what they had seen. They whispered about the mistress's strange commands, about the sons who visited cabins under orders, about children born with pale skin and blue eyes who were still enslaved. These whispers were acts of survival, a way of naming the abuse they endured, of refusing to let silence swallow their truth. Mothers warned daughters in hushed tones, urging them to be wary of the master's gaze or the mistress's demands. In whispered words, enslaved people passed down both caution and courage. The hypocrisy of the white community was especially sharp. Many of the same people who whispered about the plantation ladies' practices outwardly condemned immorality in public. They attended church, hosted prayer circles, and scolded their children for sins far less severe than the ones hidden in their midst. Yet their whispers were laced with fascination as much as disgust. Scandal entertained them, so long as it remained unspoken. They would gossip in kitchens and parlors, then smile politely to the lady's face at Sunday gatherings, complicit in the silence that allowed her cruelty to continue unchecked. Sometimes whispers carried beyond the community. Abolitionist travelers, northern merchants, or disillusioned Southerners caught fragments of these stories and carried them outward. A hushed comment from a tavern, a half-heard confession from a servant, a rumor tucked into a letter. These became fuel for anti-slavery voices who sought to show the North just how corrupt the South had become. Though not every story could be confirmed, the sheer number of whispers painted a damning picture. And yet, for those still enslaved in Georgia, whispers did little to ease their suffering. They lived not on rumor but on the daily reality of abuse. For the plantation lady, whispers were both a threat and a weapon. She knew what was said about her, and she likely used fear to keep it contained. A woman of her wealth could crush a rumor with money, favors, or intimidation. Neighbors might suspect her, but to challenge her openly would mean risking lawsuits, duels, or social ruin. In this way, whispers became a kind of currency, circulating just enough to stain her reputation in secret, but never enough to spark public scandal. Her cruelty survived not because no one knew, but because no one dared to make the whispers loud. Yet the persistence of whispers shows something important. Truth refuses to be buried. Even in a world designed to silence the enslaved and protect the powerful, fragments of the story slipped through the cracks. The community could not keep it entirely contained. Whispers about children born of forced incestuous unions. Whispers about enslaved women driven to despair. Whispers about a mistress who crossed even the South's elastic moral lines. These ensured that the story lingered, like a shadow trailing the plantation family through generations. For the enslaved, whispers held another kind of power memory. By whispering the truth to each other, they kept their story alive. Even when records were burned or lies told in court, whispers traveled down generations. Enslaved mothers told their children, children told their grandchildren, and in this way the memory of abuse survived. Whispers were the thread that tied one generation's suffering to the next understanding. Though they could not stop the pain, they ensured that silence would not erase it completely. Community whispers, then, were double-edged. For the white elite, they were a tool of control, spread enough to warn but never enough to challenge. For the enslaved, they were survival, quiet acts of truth in a world of lies. Together, they created a haunting soundscape of Southern society where secrets hummed beneath the surface but never fully broke free. The story of the Georgia plantation lady is proof that whispers mattered. They reveal a society built on silence but rattled by guilt. They show how even the most powerful could not fully escape suspicion, how cruelty carried its own echo through communities. And most importantly, they show that even in the darkest times, enslaved voices, though hushed, were never completely silenced. Their whispers lived on, reaching us now as fragments of history, demanding to be pieced together into the truth that the community tried so hard to hide. The South of 1847 dressed itself in the garments of piety. Every Sunday church bells rang through the air, summoning planters and their families to pews polished by wealth and tradition. Prayers were offered, hymns rose to the rafters, and ministers thundered from pulpits about sin, virtue, and the path to salvation. Yet outside those church walls, on plantations across Georgia and beyond, cruelty reigned unchecked. Nowhere was this contradiction more glaring than in the case of the plantation lady who, while outwardly devout, commanded her sons to breed enslaved women for profit. Her actions revealed the stark hypocrisy of a society that claimed to live by the Bible even as it twisted Scripture to justify inhumanity. For the plantation class, religion was both a shield and a sword. The Bible was quoted often, but selectively, used to defend the institution of slavery rather than challenge it. The verses about servants obeying masters were lifted from Scripture and preached as divine endorsement of bondage. Ministers reassured congregations that slavery was part of God's plan, a natural order where white masters ruled and black people served. This theology allowed planters to kneel in prayer on Sunday morning and order the lash to fall on Monday afternoon without feeling contradiction. The plantation lady herself embodied this hypocrisy. She hosted gatherings of prayer and claimed to be a woman of faith, yet behind her plantation doors she orchestrated acts that violated every moral principle her religion claimed to uphold. To force enslaved women into breeding with her own sons was not only an abuse of power, but an act that carried echoes of incest, lust, and violence, sins condemned even in the most forgiving of sermons. Yet she cloaked her deeds in silence, confident that her social standing and the complicity of the church would shield her from consequence. The enslaved, too, were drawn into this theater of piety. Many planters insisted their slaves attend services, but these gatherings were carefully controlled. White ministers preached obedience, warning the enslaved that rebellion was a sin and that their suffering would be rewarded only in heaven. Religion, in this distorted form, became another chain, binding minds as tightly as shackles bound wrists. Enslaved women who endured violation were told to accept their fate, to forgive their abusers, and to trust in God's justice in the afterlife. The hypocrisy was staggering. The very faith that should have offered solace was weaponized to enforce submission. Yet, beneath the surface, enslaved people found their own spiritual resistance. They whispered prayers in the dark, sang hymns with double meanings, and created a faith that rejected the hypocrisy of their masters. In their secret gatherings, they reclaimed the God of liberation rather than the God of bondage preached from the pulpit. To them, religion was not a justification for suffering, but a promise of freedom. This quiet defiance stood as a rebuke to the false piety of the planter class. Community members outside the plantation also played their part in this hypocrisy. Neighbors whispered about the plantation lady's practices, but continued to sit beside her in church. Ministers may have suspected but avoided naming her sins, fearing the loss of patronage. The church, which should have stood as a moral compass, became instead a shield for corruption. It preached against petty sins like gambling or gossip while ignoring the monstrous cruelty of forced breeding. It warned against lust while turning a blind eye to rape. It condemned broken families among the poor while blessing a system that shattered enslaved families daily. The greatest hypocrisy lay in the way the plantation society redefined morality itself. To them, cruelty toward enslaved people was not sin but business. Exploitation was not wickedness but enterprise. The plantation lady could sit in the front pew, donate generously to the church, and still walk home to a house built on the violation of women and the cries of children sold. Her faith was not about salvation but about appearances, another mask to cover the blood on her hands. This hypocrisy did not go unnoticed by all. Northern abolitionists seized upon such stories, pointing out the grotesque gap between Southern piety and Southern practice. They published accounts of planters who preached virtue while living in vice, of women who wore crosses around their necks while forcing others into degradation. To them, the South's religion was not Christianity at all but a hollow imitation twisted to serve power. In their eyes, the case of the Georgia plantation lady was not an outlier but a symbol of a broader sickness, a moral rot that poisoned both church and state. For the enslaved, religious hypocrisy deepened their suffering. To be told that God approved of their bondage was salt in their wounds. To watch their abusers kneel at altars and receive blessings was a cruel reminder of the world's injustice. Yet many refused to let their faith be stolen. They saw through the hypocrisy, distinguishing between the God of their hearts and the God of their masters. They clung to the hope that true justice would one day break the chains, that the hypocrisy of their oppressors would one day be exposed. The legacy of this hypocrisy stretches beyond 1847. It reveals how deeply slavery corrupted not only law and economy but faith itself. It shows how religion, instead of standing as a force of justice, was twisted into a justification for cruelty. It unmasks the plantation lady not just as a woman of wealth, but as a symbol of the South's moral collapse. One who could hold a Bible in her hand while orchestrating unspeakable sins with the other. To speak of religious hypocrisy is to confront one of the deepest betrayals of the age, that those who claimed to serve God used his name to enslave, to violate, and to profit. It is to see how the church became an accomplice in slavery's crimes, sanctifying what should have been condemned. And it is to honor the enslaved who, despite all this, held on to a truer faith, one of liberation, dignity, and hope. The bells of George's churches rang each Sunday, but their sound carried a hollow note. Beneath their chime lay the cries of the enslaved, the whispers of scandal, and the silence of complicity. The plantation lady's story is only one, but it echoes the truth of an entire society that religion, when bound to power and profit, can become not a path to God but a mask for evil. Slavery was at its core an economic machine. Behind the sermons, the traditions, and the myths of Southern honor lay the hard truth. Plantations thrived on profit, and enslaved bodies were the currency. In Georgia, 1847, when the plantation lady ordered her own sons to breed enslaved women, her actions were not just born of cruelty or perversion. They were driven by economic calculation. To her, each enslaved woman was not only a laborer but also a womb that could produce more laborers. Each child born was wealth in human form, a future worker or a commodity to be sold. The system was designed to multiply itself, and her command to turn breeding into policy was the ultimate reflection of slavery's cold economic motive. By the mid-19th century, the transatlantic slave trade had long been outlawed in the United States. No new Africans could be imported to fill the labor demands of the expanding cotton empire. Yet the hunger for enslaved labor grew sharper with each passing year, especially as cotton plantations spread across the Deep South. This created an urgent problem for planters: how to maintain and increase their enslaved populations without foreign supply. The answer was simple and cruel: force enslaved women to bear more children. Slave breeding became not just tolerated but encouraged, a silent but systematic practice across the South. The plantation lady in Georgia saw this as her path to wealth and security. To her, enslaved women were investments, and their children were returns. By ordering her sons to father children with them, she was ensuring that her estate would never lack for laborers. Every child born expanded her property without cost beyond food and rags. The grotesque logic was clear. Why purchase enslaved people from traders when the plantation could produce its own? Her greed turned reproduction into industry, transforming intimate human life into a factory for wealth. The economic motive explains why her actions, though whispered about, were not wholly unique. Across the South, records and testimonies show that enslaved women were forced into pairings for no other reason than to increase stock. In some cases, men were chosen for their size and strength, women for their health and fertility, much like livestock breeding. But in this case, the mistress's choice to use her own sons was both shocking and revealing. It showed how economic motive could strip even taboo of its power. The priority was not morality but money. Even incestuous arrangements could be justified if they promised more children born into bondage. Children produced through these forced unions were assets in more ways than one. They provided future hands to pick cotton and work the fields. Ensuring the plantation's productivity, they also served as commodities for sale. A healthy young boy could fetch a high price at market, his value rising as he grew. Girls, too, were seen as valuable not only for their labor but for their ability to continue the cycle of reproduction. To the mistress, each child was not a person but a number on her ledger, a unit of profit to secure her family's place among Georgia's elite. The coldness of the economic motive is revealed in how little care was given to the lives of enslaved children beyond their economic usefulness. Infants were often left in the care of older women while mothers returned to the fields within days of childbirth. Nutrition was scarce, medical care almost non-existent. Many died young, but for those who survived, their futures were predetermined. At age 6 or 7, they would begin small tasks, growing into full laborers by adolescence. Their entire existence was mapped out by the plantation's needs, not their own desires. The economic motive also explains why silence surrounded the mistress's practices. Neighbors may have whispered, but few condemned her outright, because they too benefited from the same logic. Their own wealth rested on the same cruel cycle of labor and breeding. To openly criticize her would be to risk exposing themselves. Ministers, too, avoided the subject, for their congregations were built on the wealth of slaveholders. Thus, economics bound the community together in complicity. Everyone knew the truth. that profit came from pain, but none dared confront it. The plantation lady's economic motive extended beyond her lifetime. By ensuring her estate continually produced new enslaved children, she secured not just her wealth but her family's legacy. She treated human reproduction as inheritance planning, guaranteeing that her sons and daughters would inherit not only land but an ever-growing enslaved population. For her, this was foresight. For the enslaved, it was despair. Their children's futures were stolen before they were even born, their lives predetermined as tools of another's greed. Yet, within this system of cold calculation, enslaved people resisted in quiet, powerful ways. Some women sought to delay or prevent pregnancies, using traditional knowledge passed down from Africa to limit fertility when they could. Others fought to protect their children, hiding them from overseers or teaching them skills that might one day aid escape. Enslaved men and women formed bonds of family and love in defiance of the economic logic that saw them only as breeders. These acts of humanity challenged the mistress's vision, proving that even in a world ruled by profit, the enslaved clung fiercely to dignity. The larger economy of the South was built on this same motive. Cotton exports fueled global markets, and enslaved labor provided the foundation. Planters, merchants, banks, and even northern industries profited from the cycle. The mistress's cruel command to her sons was not an isolated act of perversion. It was part of a vast economic machine that treated people as property. Their most personal acts of life and love converted into capital. Her plantation was one piece of an empire where profit was always placed above humanity. In the end, the economic motive reveals the true face of slavery. It was not simply prejudice or hatred that sustained the system, though both played their part. It was money, the relentless drive to extract wealth at any cost. The plantation lady's actions show how far that drive could go, stripping away morality, decency, and even natural taboo in the pursuit of gain. Her decision to breed enslaved women with her own sons was not madness but calculation, proof of how slavery's economics corrupted everything it touched. To tell this story is to confront the brutal truth. Slavery was not only an institution of labor but of profit, one that turned human lives into balance sheets and children into currency. The plantation lady of Georgia may have stood out for the extremity of her acts, but she was part of a wider system where economics dictated cruelty. Her wealth, her status, her family's future, all were built upon the backs of those she enslaved, whose very existence was reshaped into an engine for her greed. The story of 1847 reminds us that slavery was never just about the whip or the chain. It was about the ledger. And until profit was placed above people, there would always be those willing to commit the unspeakable in the name of economic gain. History is built not only on what is remembered but also on what is deliberately hidden. In the case of the Georgia plantation mistress of 1847, who bred enslaved women with her own sons, much of the truth did not survive in neat ledgers or open confessions. Instead, it lay buried, concealed in whispers, erased in official accounts, or lost in the silences that slavery forced upon its victims. The deliberate destruction and suppression of records were as much a part of slavery as the chains and the whip. The act of burying the truth protected the guilty, but it also robbed generations of clarity, forcing us to piece together fragments to glimpse the full horror of what occurred. The South was a society obsessed with appearances. While the economic machinery of slavery was brutal and raw, planners carefully crafted an image of refinement, honor, and piety. Women like the Georgia mistress, pillars of Southern gentility, could not allow their reputations to be stained by whispers of incest and forced breeding. Thus, when events crossed into scandalous territory, they were quietly removed from written records. Plantation ledgers might record births of enslaved children, but never their true parentage. Journals might note new arrivals, without acknowledging they were born on the very plantation itself. Church logs might speak of blessings and baptisms while never naming the fathers. Silence was not accidental. It was a calculated protection. Even when evidence existed, it was often destroyed. Letters detailing delicate matters were burned. Family Bibles, which often held the births of white children in meticulous detail, omitted enslaved children altogether. Court cases that might have exposed such secrets were buried in legal technicalities or vanished into lost archives. In some cases, enslaved people themselves, who carried the truth in memory, were denied the ability to record their experiences. Literacy was forbidden, and speaking out carried brutal consequences. Thus, The records that might have told their side of a story were smothered before they could exist. The mistress's estate itself revealed the pattern. While plantation documents survive in fragments, nowhere do they openly admit the incestuous breeding arrangements she enforced. Instead, researchers find clues hidden between lines: sudden increases in enslaved births with no purchases recorded, the ages of mothers and the suspicious alignment with the ages of her sons, whispers in letters from visitors who noted peculiar arrangements. What is missing speaks louder than what remains. The gaps, the erasures, the carefully crafted silences point directly to the crimes that could not be spoken aloud. The practice of burying records was not confined to her plantation. Across the South, planters engaged in the same sanitizing process. In public, they defended slavery as a benevolent system, full of care and paternalism. In private, they enforced cruelty and exploitation that no written page could capture. To preserve the myth of honor, they hid the brutal realities of forced breeding, incest, sexual violence, and economic manipulation. Their descendants, inheriting both wealth and reputation, often continued this silence. By the time historians searched the archives, much of the evidence had already been destroyed, leaving behind only fragments. But silence does not mean absence. Enslaved people preserved memory through oral tradition. Stories were whispered in the quarters, passed down through generations, often coded in song or tale. These oral histories kept alive the truth that the ledgers sought to erase. They carried the knowledge of who fathered whom, who forced whom, and what unspeakable acts were committed under the guise of plantation respectability. Though they could not write it down, their voices became the counter-record. The hidden archive of the enslaved, the buried records, also include the psychological scars carried by descendants. Families broken by forced breeding left legacies of loss, trauma, and silence. Genealogical traces often dead and in the mid-19th century, with enslaved mothers' names unrecorded, fathers unacknowledged, and children reduced to numbers. Modern descendants searching for their roots find themselves staring into gaps, proof of the system's deliberate erasure. DNA studies sometimes uncover the hidden truths, revealing genetic links between white families and enslaved descendants, but the written proof is absent, wiped clean by ancestors who buried shame beneath silence. Why were these records buried? Because truth was dangerous. If the full reality of slavery had been openly recorded, it would have exposed the moral bankruptcy of the system. Planters needed to maintain the illusion of order, morality, and divine sanction. To admit that a plantation lady forced her sons to impregnate enslaved women would have shattered that illusion, revealing not just cruelty but corruption at the very heart of the Southern ideal. Silence was protection, for wealth, for reputation, and for the fragile myths that upheld an entire society. The absence of records also reveals a grim irony. Those who suffered most left behind the least paper trail, while those who inflicted suffering left behind endless documents of property, profit, and self-praise. Historians reconstructing this story must therefore read between the lines, searching for what is not said. A spike in enslaved births without purchases, sudden shifts in household dynamics, hints in neighboring letters, all become evidence. The buried record is not a blank but a silence filled with meaning, an erasure that itself speaks of guilt. And yet even buried truth has a way of resurfacing. Oral histories, archaeology, DNA, and the persistence of memory work together to unearth what was meant to be forgotten. The story of the Georgia mistress survives not because she recorded it, but because those who endured it refused to let it vanish completely. The buried record is being exhumed piece by piece, and with it, the world is forced to confront the shadows hidden beneath Southern myths. The story of the buried records is ultimately a warning. Power has always sought to shape memory, to erase what is inconvenient, to bury what is shameful. But silence cannot erase suffering, and hidden crimes have a way of haunting the present. The Georgia mistress may have thought her secret safe, but history continues to dig, to question, and to uncover. Every missing line, every burned letter, every silence is itself a testimony, a record of what those in power most feared would be known. The Georgia mistress of 1847 believed her secrets would be carried to the grave. She believed her plantation, her family name, and her wealth would outlast whispers of scandal. But history has a way of clinging to what people try hardest to bury. The story of forced breeding, incest, and the children born into bondage did not vanish. It lingered, haunting both the descendants of the enslaved and the family who built their fortune upon their suffering. This legacy stretches far beyond the plantation gates, shaping how memory, trauma, and identity echo across centuries. The haunting legacy begins with blood. The children born from the mistress's orders carried within them the intertwined lineages of the enslaved and their white masters. They grew up neither fully acknowledged nor entirely invisible. In the fields, they labored like the rest of the enslaved. Yet in their features, lighter skin, straighter hair, was evidence of their paternity. For some, this brought harsher treatment from the mistress herself, who could not bear to see her husband's or son's faces reflected in children she considered property. For others, it meant being sold away quickly, scattered across Georgia and beyond, so no physical reminder remained at home. Each child was a living record of crimes unspoken, their very existence both proof and accusation. For the enslaved families, this legacy was generational trauma. Mothers who were forced into pregnancies carried shame, grief, and rage that they could not express openly. Their children, born of violence, grew up in a system that denied them dignity. Even after emancipation, descendants carried the weight of this history, often without the details. They knew only fragments, that a grandmother had been used for breeding, that their family line was tied to the masters, that their ancestors' bodies had been controlled for profit. This silence was its own form of haunting, where unanswered questions passed down like heirlooms. The mistress's own family could not escape either. Though her descendants inherited her wealth and land, they also inherited her secrets. Many families in the South passed down wealth built on slavery, but alongside it came unease, guilt, and denial. Generations later, some sought to distance themselves, claiming ignorance or innocence. Yet DNA and historical research continue to expose connections, forcing families to confront truths their ancestors buried. The haunting legacy here is not only in the bloodlines but in the discomfort of privilege built on violence. The land itself holds the memory. Old plantations across Georgia stand as monuments to wealth built on exploitation. Beneath their soil lie unmarked graves of enslaved people, their names forgotten, their stories erased. Each plowed field and collapsing barn is a reminder of lives lived and lost in bondage. The haunting is not metaphorical. It is physical, embedded in the geography. Visitors to such sites often speak of unease, of a heaviness that lingers in the air, as though the past refuses to be silenced. The plantation where the mistress once ruled would be no different, its earth soaked with untold stories. The legacy also haunts the larger society. America continues to wrestle with the consequences of slavery, from racial inequality to the struggles of identity among descendants of the enslaved. The mistress's story is not an isolated scandal. It is a window into the broader truth that slavery was filled with buried abuses, silenced histories, and hidden lineages. Her cruelty symbolizes the lengths to which profit and power could corrupt, and the shadows of those acts still shape conversations today about race, justice, and memory. The haunting legacy is visible in the gaps of history textbooks, in the debates over monuments, and in the discomfort of acknowledging what truly built the wealth of the South. For historians, the haunting is also methodological. The buried records we explored in the previous chapter force researchers to reconstruct stories from fragments, oral histories, and indirect clues. Each missing page is a reminder of intentional erasure, yet also an invitation to keep searching. The mistress's story haunts because it is incomplete, never fully written, always pursued through echoes and silences. That incompleteness itself is the legacy of a system built on concealment. And yet, haunting can also be a form of justice. The fact that we still speak of this story in 2025 means her attempt at erasure failed. The enslaved women she tried to reduce to breeding stock left behind descendants who survived, resisted, and carried their humanity forward. Their blood runs in families who thrive today, even if they do not know the full names of those ancestors. The mistress's wealth may have faded, her family name perhaps forgotten, but the resilience of those she enslaved continues to endure. In that endurance lies a reversal. Her legacy is not one of triumph but of infamy, while theirs is one of survival against unimaginable cruelty. The haunting legacy also forces us to confront the moral costs of silence. The neighbors who looked away, the ministers who preached obedience, the record keepers who omitted the truth. They, too, are part of this story. Their complicity haunts the historical record as much as the mistress's cruelty. This collective silence shows how entire communities enabled abuses by refusing to speak, and it serves as a warning about the dangers of ignoring injustice in any age. Perhaps the most haunting legacy of all is the way slavery tried to redefine humanity. By turning children into property and reproduction into industry, it warped relationships and identities for generations. The mistress's command to her sons was not only an act of cruelty, but a profound violation of the natural bonds between parent and child, man and woman, family and community. It revealed how slavery could twist even the most sacred human ties into tools of exploitation. That distortion lingers in memory, a shadow over all who lived through it and their descendants. In the end, the Georgia mistress's legacy is not measured in land or wealth, but in the weight of the truth she tried to bury. The haunting is not ghosts in the night. It is the persistence of memory, the refusal of history to let silence stand. Every retelling of her story, every uncovering of a forgotten name, every acknowledgement of her crimes is part of that haunting. It ensures that the enslaved women and children whose lives she tried to erase are remembered, and that the cruelty of her choices is never allowed to fade into genteel myth. The past cannot be undone, but it can be faced, and to face it is to honor those whose humanity was denied. The haunting legacy of 1847 Georgia is not only a reminder of cruelty, it is a call to remember, to speak, and to ensure that buried truths are unearthed, not forgotten.